are here with Carolyn Long, who is a congressional candidate for the 3rd District, and we have a few questions for you today, Carolyn.
Thanks, it's so great to be with you here today.
Okay, first question is, what are the top 3 reasons you're running?
So first, I think it's always important to remind people I'm committed and accountable to the folks of Southwest Washington. I'm running to represent them. Secondly, to fight for affordable health care for the people of the district. It's important now more than ever, and that also includes making sure we have reform for prescription drug so people have relief from those high prices. And third, it's investing in us, and that means investing in our roads and bridges and things like broadband internet, but also investing in the people of the district by creating economic pathways to success, be it colleges or universities or trade schools or apprenticeships. And to always just remind people I'm here fighting for them as their member of Congress. You know, for the last 3 years, I've been talking about the need for access to broadband internet. There's so many parts of the 3rd Congressional District where people don't have access to the internet, and that's more than Netflix. It's about access to education, access to higher education, it's access for small businesses to new markets. So I think it's important that we make sure that they have that. And now more than ever during a pandemic, we see how instrumental broadband internet access is to people doing the learning and supporting their small businesses.
So Carolyn, what did the first campaign teach you? What lessons were learned? How are you better positioned to win this time around?
So the campaign taught me how important it is to be accountable and present in the community. It's why I held 46 in-person town halls, and I learned how significant it is to listen to the people of the district by being in the district. So listening is a key part of my campaign. And the reason it is because I've learned from the people of the district how important it is to fight for access to affordable health care and lowering the cost of prescription drugs. I've heard concerns in my rural communities about economic development opportunities, and it's that in-person, face-to-face contact with voters that was a key part of the campaign last time. So I learned that that was important to get out there as much as possible. Also learned that it's important to start early, so we started our campaign a little bit earlier this time, so we had even more opportunities to meet with people. And in terms of positioning, you know, we were planning on having the same strategy of in-person town halls, but then COVID happened, and so we were able to move those to Facebook Live town halls, to Facebook Live roundtable conversations, and Zoom meetings in lieu of Coffees with Carolyn. We've held dozens of those. So I think that combination of getting out there in front of the voters last time in person, while doing that but on a more remote level this time, has made me best positioned.
Since 2018, what have you been up to?
Spending a lot of time with family and friends, going back to work at the university, of course. And I've really spent a lot of time reflecting on the race and what we could do differently and how we can be successful in the second run. So a lot of post-mortem deconstructions of the election. And then since actually 2019, I've been campaigning. So we only took a very short break because once we found out that this was a race where we could better represent the people of the district, we jumped in. And so it's really been campaigning since that time.
And what do you teach?
I teach constitutional law and public policy at the university, classes on Congress and the presidency, and also a class on public leadership.
How are you able to raise more than $682,000 in Q2? What does that say about your campaign?
Well, I think it says that we have a really strong grassroots campaign. It's important to note that those are individual contributions by and large, people giving $5 or $10, sometimes a little bit more, and almost exclusively within the state of Washington. So it shows that this is support that comes from within the district, and that I've done it without taking a dime of corporate PAC money, and that's very important. I want to be beholden to the people of Southwest Washington, not corporations. And so it's a lot of hard work, but people are really, they're responding to our message about being there for them and fighting for the issues they care about, like healthcare, prescription drug reform, and economic development.
What would you have done differently at the federal level in response to COVID-19?
First, I would have been prepared for a pandemic. We've been hearing for decades that this might happen. And when we've had people from parties from both sides really not make us prepared for when this would hit. Our strategic stockpile has been diminishing over time. So the first thing I would do is foresee this as a possibility, make sure there's adequate federal funding so we're not scraping around for personal protective equipment and trying to respond, but rather being proactive for the possibility of a pandemic. The second thing that I would do is make sure that when we are spending taxpayer dollars to address the pandemic, it's done wisely with appropriate oversight from Congress. It's tremendously important when we're taking the people's money to try to get us through an economic crisis that we make sure that it's going where it's supposed to go. And we haven't really seen that in Congress with members, including my opponent, voting against aggressive oversight. So I would have done that differently, and finally would want to make sure that the money goes where it's needed, which is small businesses and working families who have suffered the most during this pandemic. And of course, always putting public health first and making sure that there's adequate funding for that equipment people need, for testing. Seems like we've been playing catch up all along. And I would hope that the politicians in Washington, D.C. would come together with one voice to talk about putting public health first, rather than making it more of a political conversation, which is what we're seeing. So that includes holding the president to account and holding him to account for this very haphazard response for this terrible crisis we're going through.
Do you think Governor Inslee's response to COVID-19 was appropriate?
I do. One of the things the governor's done that I think we should all admire is he was governed by science and data. He listened to the public health experts, and of course he was the first governor to respond when this came to our doorstep early on. And so by listening to the public health experts, he came up with a response and then a path forward. So his phased approach in terms of reopening the economy safely was replicated by other states. So I think the emphasis on public health is very important with the governor, and he's tried to do it with an eye of getting us healthy and then getting us back to work, but doing it in a safe way.
Does the executive branch have too much power? How do you see your job as a member of Congress when it comes to your constitutional role in oversight and providing checks and balances?
You know, Ernie, I've had the pleasure of teaching constitutional law for 25 years at WSU Vancouver. And one of the things I talk a lot about is the transfer of power from the representative branch of government, Congress, to the executive branch, and how dangerous that is for our democracy. We've seen this happen under Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. We see it with the use of executive agreements as opposed to bills passed by Congress. And we've also seen Congress, frankly, abdicate its role of being the leader in lawmaking. And as a member of Congress, I vow to do two things. One is to make sure that there's always aggressive oversight whenever the executive is given authority. And that is very important and is not being done as much as it should. And the second is for members of Congress to relinquish their role of being the main policymaking branch of government. It's more representative, and it's also much more democratic, which is what we should all be aspiring for in terms of our constitutional democracy.
Which of Congresswoman Herrera's policy positions do you disagree with the most?
Her position on healthcare. For the last decade, she's been trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act without any alternative in place. And that's unconscionable. We have an act that protects people with pre-existing conditions in the tens of millions, as well as access to care with millions more. And by trying to dismantle that during a pandemic makes absolutely no sense to me. It's unfathomable. There are people who are losing their health insurance daily, and to still, in the midst of a pandemic, trying to claw that away from people without offering them an alternative by taking away protection for pre-existing conditions, and of course coronavirus will be one of them, is an area where I strongly disagree with her. It's an issue I'm running on, and it's one where I think that the American people know that my position is looking out for the health of them and their families.
Name one policy position you have in common with Congresswoman Herrera.
I would have signed her piece of legislation about sea lion and salmons. It was, of course, an amendment to an original bill passed by Brian Baird, who formerly held the seat, along with Doc Hastings, and it made that a little bit easier to do. But it also deals with the problem of our salmon at the very end rather than the beginning. So it is only a partial way of addressing salmon recovery. So I would have combined it with increased flow and spill over our dams. I would have combined it with more attention to ocean acidification, and also would have combined it with better management of our hatcheries in a way that doesn't endanger our native salmon. So I agree with that bill, but it falls far short to addressing the problem.
When will you debate Congresswoman Herrera?
I will debate my opponent anywhere, anytime, any place.
So Carolyn, one other question I want to ask you is, you talked about listening. And what did you learn in your first campaign about listening to people, and what do we need to do today in our society to listen to one another?
Sure. So as somebody running for office, I learned from Congressman Baird to always remind yourself that you have two ears and one mouth. and that the key way to hear what is on the minds of the constituents is to be there in front of them, listening to their stories, listening to what they care about, what they're concerned about. And so I think it's incredibly important for somebody running for office to have that as a key part of their campaign. It's why I did 46 in-person town halls. It's why I'm doing them over Facebook now, because I learned from the people about how to best represent them. And in terms of the general public, we do seem to be speaking across from one another. We're not speaking to one another, and we're also not even encountering one another. We live in our own silos. So some of the important work I did at the university through my Initiative for Public Deliberation is teach my students how to listen, but also how to moderate conversations where people will listen to one another. Too often people listen to respond, they don't listen to understand. So for people out there, I always recommend asking questions, asking people why they feel that particular way, so that you can have a deeper understanding of their position rather than saying that you're wrong. And I also think listening is important, because if you listen deeply to someone, you can find out those shared values and those shared beliefs, which become the foundation for a really good conversation about even difficult issues. And I've done that all my life. I'm married to a Republican, so I've learned to listen to my own household, and I certainly do that when I'm on the campaign trail, but we should all be doing it within our own families and our circles of friends.
Is there an inherent human need to be heard?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember I was in a position at the university, at a high level position, and when somebody came to me with a problem, my first response was, well, here are the 4 things that I'm going to do to fix it. And I realized very quickly that they of course wanted my answer, but they also wanted me to hear what they had to say, and that was even more important than the policy response. We want to make sure that people are listening to us, that they don't take us for granted, and that they are heard. I think it's absolutely part of human nature.
Is that part of what's going on now in all these major cities? There's a need to be heard, a frustration at the gut level in a lot of places. Is that what's happening?
I think it's a little bit about what's happening. And sometimes people don't find that their typical ways of being heard are working, so that their voices aren't being represented. And so they find alternative ways to make their voices heard. So I do think that is part of it.
Okay, thank you.